Hello and welcome to the Publisherspeak series for Peer Review Week 2022. We're delighted to speak to industry professionals from across the publishing lifecycle about peer review with a focus on this year's theme, research integrity, creating and supporting trust in research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ashwin Mahalingam, a professor of civil engineering at IIT Madras. Dr. Mahalingam's current research interests include public-private partnerships in infrastructure and the ways in which organizations react to the globalization of engineering services. He is the editor of the Engineering Project Organization Journal and has also served on many international committees. Welcome, Ashwin. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to start today with an interesting question, Ashwin. This is about the need for rapid dissemination. Everything about research today seems to be about speed, about getting things out quickly. And how do you think this has affected the quality of review? Has the need for speed now affected the quality of the research decision? Are reviewers forced to make quick decisions and rush into the process?
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. I think that is actually a very interesting question. I think we all agree that there is a need for rapid dissemination of findings so that the academic community can get access to these results far earlier and therefore make more progress. But unfortunately, what happens is in this process, editors tend to promise very aggressive timelines for the review process. So promising to have reviews back in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. In some cases where you actually have a group of reviewers on your editorial board or on your review board who have the expertise and have the bandwidth to conduct these reviews, I think it actually works out quite well. Because it also keeps the reviewers honest. They start responding to the editor's requests quickly rather than just putting the papers on the back burner. But unfortunately, 2 to 3 weeks sometimes may not be sufficient for several papers, especially those where you need to read and reread it a few times before coming to a decision. And also when you have journals with high volumes of papers, so that you enter a situation where the editorial board or the reviewers are actually full up with the number of papers that they can actually review, then as an editor, you start needing to spread your wings a little bit wider and drawing upon reviewers who may not necessarily be your first choice reviewers. And that sometimes does affect the quality of the peer review process.
What about you have a unique, profile in terms of being able to be an editor, a reviewer, and also being an author. What about the author's perspective? How do you see this happening? In many cases, you're sending your paper in, you're hoping you're getting a fair decision. How do you think authors perceive this whole process now?
Right. So from an author's perspective, on the one hand, speed is of the essence, right? Because the sooner I publish a paper, the sooner my results are sort of seen by the scientific community, the sooner my papers will get cited. And then from a purely selfish view in terms of assessment and appraisals and promotions and so on, the earlier I get that number, the earlier I can put it on my resume. So from all of those perspectives, it's important to get reviews back early. But as an author, I am looking to reviewers to provide constructive feedback in order to push my paper through the publication process. And sometimes what happens is because of these very short timelines, we have reviewers who, it is very clear, have not really paid sufficient attention to the paper and therefore have made either comments that are inappropriate, comments that have already been addressed in the text, or comments that take a paper completely in a different direction, partially because they haven't had time to engage with the paper and really understand what the paper is about and where their comments should be situated. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. You don't want 3-4 months in between the time where you submit and get a review. But at the same time, you'd like the reviewers to spend sufficient time so that they actually give constructive, addressable comments that pushes your paper forward. Even if your paper gets rejected with good comments that allows you to maybe recraft your study and republish is very important.
Brilliant. Now, another part of peer review is about, and the whole publication process is about maintaining research integrity. Now, I imagine there's lots of different tools that authors could use, and I imagine that the editors and reviewers use these tools to go evaluate these publications. So what can you speak from both perspectives, from both the editor's perspective as well as the author's perspective, as to what tools could be used to maintain research integrity?
So historically, this community has functioned on the basis of trust, right? One has always trusted the researcher to have actually performed the research that they are sort of presenting for publication and so on. Now, on the one hand, you could do very simple things like use databases like Turnitin, for instance, to understand the extent to which work might be plagiarized. But again, all of these come with caveats. Very often, you do find a lot of quote unquote plagiarism, but a lot of it is from work that the author has themselves done and perhaps presented in a conference or whatnot. References, etc., naturally will exist elsewhere. So it is a little bit of a check, but perhaps not my preferred mode of dealing with this issue. What a lot of journals are doing now is trying to request data, that raw data be submitted along with the paper, which I think is a fair enough ask. But then the question is, to what extent does the reviewer actually have the bandwidth to essentially recreate the study and the analysis to confirm whether what the author has presented is true or not? Right. So, but I do think it is a welcome move to ask for the data, etc. Because even if you're not using it in the review process, there could be a researcher down the line who might benefit from that. But ultimately, to me, it comes down to number one, trust, and secondly, this is where the role of the reviewer is very important, because the reviewer is expected to be somebody who is knowledgeable in that field and should therefore be able to assess whether the piece of research was feasible or not, was plausible or not, whether it could have been conducted in an ethical manner without recourse to other nefarious practices in terms of reusing data or using somebody else's data and so on. Right. So I would really place the burden still on the author and on the reviewer to be able to assess not only the merit, but also the feasibility of the paper, and therefore whether the authors actually did what they claimed.
Great. And trust is going to be my next topic. As you talk about trust, I think there's a lot that authors can do on their part to make sure there's trust in the process, to make sure they get a fair review. But there's also things that, unfortunately, there's some of us who try to introduce things which are not so kosher. So what do you think authors could do to help this process and help the general community in general? And how can editors encourage those practices?
Right. So typically in most papers, there is a methodology section. Right. So it's sort of the heart of the paper. Now, historically, because authors have been very keen to perhaps publish the findings of their work, the methodology section gains short shrift, right? So it's a very brief methodology, this kind of statistical analysis was used or whatever, and then you jump straight into the findings. I see now a lot of journals giving a lot of weightage to that methodology section and essentially asking the authors to explain in as granular detail as possible how they went about their study, how they collected the data, how they organized it, where they organized it. Can they provide some examples of how they analyzed it and so on, in addition to allowing for appendices, etc., that actually provide the full-on data support, right? So I think that to me is critical, is something that we should continue doing as a community. Certain schools of thought or certain areas of study have always prioritized that. So the literature on, for instance, on management, which tends to be very qualitative, right? So again, we need to understand that when you look at quantitative research, if you give me the same data that you used, I should be able to run the same simulation and get the same results. But in qualitative research, when I've interviewed somebody, first of all, I may not be able to tell you who I interviewed because of reasons of confidentiality. And even if I did, there's no guarantee that they would respond in exactly the same way if you ask these questions, because the way in which we express things, etc., changes over time. I mean, we had this interview again in half an hour. I would probably give broadly the same answer, but the wording, etc., would be quite different. So those kinds of schools have always emphasized methodology, that you explain very clearly what and how you've done something. The quantitative researchers have tended to sort of ignore that, the experimental researchers. But I think we really need to bring that back and strengthen the way researchers explain their methodology to a point where it's easy for a reviewer or an editor to say, yes, I mean, we now believe that you know enough about the process that you've actually conducted it yourself.
I think that's a brilliant point that you make about methodology and how you're actually seeing the background behind this particular research, how the author has gone about it, and looking at it from that perspective, rather than trying to say, hey, are there self-citations? Are there citations of retracted papers? And going down this path of, hey, I have no trust, so I'm just going to try and eliminate. But I think this whole aspect of trying to understand the whole reasoning behind the author, looking at the methodology section, and then evaluating the rest of the paper is a really good one. I hope more publishers hear this and start to apply that towards the whole review process. So Ashwin, one of the big challenges that we hear today is that there's not enough people to review. There's a lot of people writing, but it's not enough people to review. And what happens is the same pool of reviewers gets tapped for all the reviews that are happening. And so there's at least there's a feeling from publishers that one way to make it easier is to start compensating reviewers. Now, peer review has traditionally been a voluntary activity. You do it for the interest of spreading good science. And now when you bring in a compensation, either be monetary or non, is something that now has the potential of coloring the whole equation. What is your thought on this? What do you think it could do to the problem?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question that has to be debated in detail, because I don't think it's quite simple. On the one hand, compensating reviewers is prima facie not a bad thing, because they are putting in some effort for someone else. They've done it voluntarily in the past, but there is effort that's being put in. Typically, for instance, just as an example, as a professor at IIT Madras, I review PhD theses from other universities. And often and almost always, I'm given some kind of an honorarium for reviewing a PhD thesis on behalf of another university. So this is quite similar. Reviewing a paper for another journal, I get an honorarium. But the question then is, where does this money come from? And if this money is going to come from, for instance, charges that authors will need to pay in order to not only get their article published, but to actually get it through the peer review process, then that creates a huge barrier to entry for people submitting these papers. So I think we need to sort of work out how this will work in a manner whereby we don't make these journals exclusive. I think that's already a little bit of a complaint that people have on the whole open access movement, where you charge to publish, saying the charges are so high that certain people are unable to publish in certain outlets just because they lack the financial means to do so. You don't want to add another layer to that and say, look, unless you have the financial means to pay for reviews, we won't be able to review your paper. So we'll have to think through it a little bit. But if there's a model by which, without burdening the authors, reviewers could be compensated, and perhaps there's some kind of an incentivized compensation based on not only how quickly you review, but also the quality of the review, which the editor might judge, I think that could be an interesting system that we could think about.
Some great ideas. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, it does require a lot of debate. I'm sure there's different schools of thought for each one. So something to figure out. On the question of communicating research, would you say that we're doing a good job of research reaching the scientific community and also research reaching the general community at large? Is it just being kind of held in a small circle? It takes years before it actually reaches the general public.
So today, I guess in most cases, research is quite accessible to a lot of people because journals are now digital. Almost every journal most journals still have a print version, but I think most of them have a complementary digital version as well. Most universities now seem to subscribe to these journal databases, and therefore getting your hands on a paper, if you knew what paper you wanted to get your hands on, is not as big a challenge as it used to be a few years ago. I'm sure there are still pockets where this is not as easily accessible and so on. The issue, though, is that given the proliferation in the number of journals and the number of articles that are being published over the recent past, it becomes very difficult to separate the wheat from the chaff, right? To try to figure out which are the papers that are really worth reading and worth citing, because there's just so much clutter out there. And I think that's where we have some work to do in terms of trying to declutter all of this scientific research that's coming out and trying to promote the content that is really cutting edge and innovative and so on. Partly, I think it's up to academic communities to do that. I think editors of journals probably know best as to what the really good papers are that have been published in their journals, probably need to highlight and market those. Organizers of conferences need to sort of call these people to give keynote talks. I think there's a lot of work that the academic community needs to do on that front. But particularly with regards to your other point on disseminating it to the masses, perhaps more in sort of popular science fashion, I think that's something that publishers can really think about. So that, very, short policy brief kind of kinds of versions of articles can very quickly reach a lot of people who may not have the time or wherewithal to read a 10,000 word journal article. I know a few journals that are already doing this and actually have nice glossy publications that they pass around, which are essentially quick, practitioner oriented summaries of academic work that's done just for like very quick dissemination and review.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's journals now experimenting with things like lay summaries and visual abstracts and other ways of getting out to the public. It obviously costs some amount of resource and time. So it's a matter of how to balance it out. Who pays for it? How do you get this out in a fashion that's usable? So I think that it's a good thing is that publishers are experimenting, and along with authors, we should be able to evolve a system that works. Now, we have this whole new world of open research. We're talking about open research, transparent reporting. How do you think this is contributing to helping research integrity? Do you believe that they lead to better integrity in research or not? What is your opinion?
Well, I think as in most things, researchers that have always had good integrity will continue to have good integrity, and there will always be a few bad apples in the box. So I think the whole transparency movement, I mean, certainly it forces people to be a little bit less creative with their data. I think by and large, people, I think, have not really cheated very much in the past in most of the communities that I've been at. But sometimes you have a little bit of creative interpretation around the edges of your data, which now you are unable to do because the entire data is transparent. But more than that, I think what this transparency is likely to achieve is that you have data sets that can now be shared across researchers, leading to far more creative research coming out, right? Because I might have an idea, but I may not be able to access a data set. But now, because of this whole transparency protocol, I can access this data set that somehow you were able to put together because you had a differential set of access conditions. And I can combine my creativity and intuition with your data to publish a paper, to publish perhaps a highly impactful paper that we may never have been able to publish before if your data had been close to my insights. So I think that's really what I'm looking forward to seeing, is really interesting and creative papers where people don't necessarily need to spend their own time on data collection, but can take these data repositories, run their analysis on it, and come up with new insights that the original researchers were unable to bring up.
It's a really good point, Ashwin. In fact, some of my discussions with publishers, what we're starting to talk about is the nature of what a publication is going to change. And you could just publish your method section. You could just publish your data set. And that could be considered a publication, which somebody else could then build upon and do the findings like you suggested. So I think we are in for a new world where we start to look at it very differently. And so once we start sharing, I think it will mean research will definitely be sped up. Even negative results could be a fantastic resource on which to build your research. So one of the big introductions or big impact that has happened out of COVID is the advancement of the preprint server. The preprint server has now become a way for you to get your research out there quickly in front of your peers so they can go review it. And some believe that the preprint server is now helping to improve research integrity. What has happened in your particular field, and what do you think of its impact?
See, in my community, to be honest, I don't think the preprint server has had as much of an impact, because I think preprint servers have a lot of impact where there is a lot of time between submission / acceptance and publication. And in our case, and also partly because of CreaDocs and the fact that we were on this platform and the entire processing was extremely fast, we never really felt the lack of a preprint server process, so it didn't really impact us. But I do agree, I'm not sure about its impact on transparency, but I do agree that in journals where this takes a little bit longer, I think these innovations are quite useful to the authors in terms of being able to get that get the word out as quickly as possible, and more importantly, have people start citing the paper. I think that's where getting the word out you often do through other means. You've probably given a couple of talks about your paper even before it was published. You've probably presented a version of it in the conference. So people already know about this work. But for them to cite it, there needs to be something out there that can be cited. And that's where I think this becomes important. So you start building your citations up ahead.
Absolutely. I think the VOR is still the only entity that people would say is ready to be cited. But I think one of the good developments I see happening in some of my conversations, publishers are talking about if an article has gone through the preprint route and then come in for peer review, we're now going to start looking at relaxing, or rather much higher acceptance rates, saying, hey, it's already been through the review process, already gone through a lot of discussion and so on. And so at that point, now we're starting to see that a lot more papers could be accepted by our journal because due diligence has happened and happened openly because they trust the process. I think that's going to be a good development for authors. And I'm hoping that in general, just being open to sharing means everybody across the system, the trust improves across the board.
Yeah, I think certainly there are going to be some advantages. But at the same time, I think a lot of journals, so when you take an article through the review process, one is to check the article and make sure that the results are appropriate and so on. But there are also other things that one looks for as an editor. One, for instance, looks for the extent to which this article really fits or progresses a debate or a discussion that's already happening in that journal or in that community. And from that perspective, there are probably certain papers or certain debates that you want this article to cite and build upon. So that even though the results have been verified, you still want the narrative of the paper to change to be able to push the entire debate in a particular direction. And so I think in many cases, or in at least in some cases, I think you'll find that editors will say, yes, maybe I don't have to be as methodologically rigorous in my review, but we certainly need to sort of see how best this paper would fit into the journal and how best it would push forward the kind of debates that we're having. And so that would still take a fair amount of time through the review process and so on.
Absolutely, really good point on that front. We've talked about the authors, we've talked about the reviewers in terms of trust and integrity. What about the publishers and funders? What do you think that they could do to encourage authors and everybody to have more integrity in what they're doing?
Well, I think, the first sort of thing that I think publishers are well placed to do is generally educate the entire community on, on the ethics of publishing. These days, most journals have one of these ethics statements, but actually it's the publisher. In many cases, you'll find the ethics statements are actually quite similar because the publisher has taken the effort to carve out a code of ethics, which then each of their journals decides to adopt. And the reason this is important is, I think by and large, we know what's right and what's wrong. I mean, naturally, if I stole data from somebody or if I just fudged up my own data and did analysis, we know that's wrong. But there are various shades of gray, right? In terms of, I have borrowed part of a data set from somebody. Do I need to cite that someone? Do I not? Was this in the public domain? Was it not? What kind of caveats should I put in? So I think the whole ethics question and the trust question is a little bit more nuanced. And I think publishers can really help educate a larger audience because they reach out to, whenever I go to publish a paper in a journal or to submit a paper to a journal, I read through the author statements, the ethical code of conduct requirements, etc. And so that would help me as a researcher understand what I should and should not do, and if my paper has violated any of these, any of these laws, in which case I need to sort of go back and try to redo the analysis. So I think that whole education, information dissemination, I think is something that's critical that publishers can do, that can reach out across communities. Typically, an editor or an editorial board can reach out to one particular community and say, look, these are the rules of the game. But publishers, I think, have a much larger reach, can come up with, and because of that diversity, you can just come up with so many examples of here's what's right and here's what's wrong, that you can really create these nice sort of documents on how you go about conducting ethical research, where you draw the line, what's possible, what isn't, convening these kinds of events, perhaps even panel discussions at various fora where one would discuss this, I think would be another thing that publishers could do. I've seen this happen in a couple of conferences where there is a publishing house with 4 or 5 journals underneath them, and they bring the editors of these journals together for a panel discussion. Typically, these panels in the past have been about how do you get a paper through the acceptance process? What do reviewers look for? And that's the classic topic. But I think we could now start reconstituting these panels based more on the ethics of publishing, right? And again, that's something that publishers are well placed to do because it's very easy for them to call up editors of journals that are under them and bring them together. Whereas getting a conference organizer or getting one editor to try to coordinate this with other editors is a bit more challenging. So those are a couple of ideas. I'm sure there are more.
That's a brilliant observation, Ashwin. I think if publishers focus on education rather than reforming, I think education is the best way to bring in trust back into the process, educate people as to why this is important, how that will lead to sound research. think that's definitely a key word to take away from that perspective. If I had to take this forward and say, we have to start early. You have to educate, but you also have to start early where the early career researchers are coming into the process. How do you involve them? Some journals actually include them in their editorial boards. What is your opinion on that? How can we bring them along? How can we teach them the right way of doing things before it gets too late?
Well, I would even argue that it's already too late if they're already an academic, because they've gone through a PhD process, which is where they have learned and trained to be researchers. The rest of it is actually just sort of implementing that training to deliver a lots of research projects. So I would even go one step sort of earlier and catch people when they were PhD students, particularly midway through the PhD, where you're actually grappling with data and analysis and so on. So what, for instance, our community does is in our annual conference, the day before, typically, we have something called a PhD day, open only to PhD students. Of course, people apply. We have a limited number of seats depending on the amount of funding we have. And we spend a day essentially talking about the transition from a PhD into academia. And of course, we also provide feedback on the specific papers that, or the specific pieces of research that they're working on. And we've sort of late started looking at ethics in publishing as one of the topics that we will cover. And I know many other societies do these PhD day kind of events. In the sidelines of the marquee conference, they have a session for PhD students. Partly it's because many universities are looking to recruit these students. So it's always good to get all the PhDs in one roof and all of that. So there's other reasons. But given that you're bringing these people in, I think that's again an opportunity for potentially publishers as well to team up with the organizing group of these conferences and say, look, could we take up this chunk on publishing and ethics and so on, right? So I think it needs to really be done at the PhD level, and perhaps, or it would be nice if it could be done at the PhD level. If it can't, yes, you want to catch early career faculty. And that's again something else that I think publishers should try and do, is to make sure that your editorial board has a mix of experienced people, but as well as new faculty who sort of come in, because one of the ways you learn is through being part of that review process, where you understand how the reviewers, how the editors are making decisions, how the reviewers are making decisions. Again, in our the journal that we run, the Engineering Project Organizations Journal, we have associate editors who are typically senior, but we have assistant editors who are often always people who are relatively new into the community, right? Young faculty who go through that process. So that's something, again, that publishers could probably try to sort of insist upon, probably create a norm where you say certain number of assistant editors need to be 0 to 5 years into their career. So, yeah.
That's a fantastic suggestion, Ashwin. I think it makes complete sense. Bringing them early into the process definitely means you'll have a better result, upstream thinking. So I'm going to end this particular session with a vision question. So you've been through, I think you've been a researcher now for over 20 years. You've been through lots of different processes. You've seen a peer review evolving. Where do you see the next 10 years? Where do you see peer review changing in the next 10 years?
Well, it's a very good question. I don't think, a lot of us like to think we can predict the future, but the future always turns out to have a few interesting twists and turns. But this is what I'll say. I think fundamentally, the peer review process will not change, in the sense that you always want an extra set of eyes and ears to do a thorough check or review of something that is being presented, right? So fundamentally, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change. Where I think we might see change is in the whole publication process, where we went in many parts of the world 20 years ago, nobody was incentivized to publish. Then we went through a phase where people have been incentivized to publish, and it's now become a numbers game, right? So essentially, in a lot of places, it's the number of publications that count. And that's led to this proliferation of journals, papers, the need to reduce review times to be able to deal with all of this volume, all of that. But I think in about 10 years, hopefully, we'll find a way to move past quantity and into quality, right? Through a variety of mechanisms that various universities will adopt. Of course, we've already started segregating journals into high quartile, low quartile, things like that. We've come out with a bunch of indices, impact factors, and so on, and possibly push people towards publishing lower volume but higher impact work. And what that will do is, when you think back to the peer review process, it will almost help us circle back to a point where we have relatively fewer papers. When I say relatively, right? So we're not going to go from 1 million papers down to 10,000, right? But it's going to be relatively fewer papers, therefore freeing up for a little bit more of the reviewers' bandwidth because there are fewer review assignments, and therefore much more rigorous and engaging, peer review. So that's how, I'm not sure this is what the world will be like in 10 years, but this is what I would like the world to be like in, say, 2030.
That was an amazing discussion, Ashwin. I really enjoyed it. I think your ideas and suggestions, I know you said you're not a fortune teller, but I suspect a lot of them will make it into reality the next 5-10 years. When we have our next discussion, I look forward to congratulating you on your foresight.
Yeah. Thanks, Ravi. Always a pleasure to be part of these discussions and sort of talk a little bit about how we can generally improve the impact of the overall academic process. So, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me.